When Americans look back at the Revolutionary War, we tend to remember the patriots who shaped the country through the ideals, rights, and system of government set out in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Often, we forget or overlook the men who won the ability to shape the country. One such man was General Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel Greene is an important figure to remember in light of the upcoming 250th anniversary of the Revolution, because in a time when patriotism is on the decline in America, especially in younger generations, Nathaniel Greene's devotion for his country should serve as an example for all Americans. Nathaniel Greene's rise to prominence through self-education and loyal service is an inspiration. Nathaniel Greene was born into a highly structured Quaker house. The Bible was the primary mode of education for young Nathaniel Greene. Later in childhood, Nathaniel Greene began to develop a fascination with military history. This interest earned him admonishments from the uncompromisingly pacifist Quakers. Despite this, Greene continued to learn about military strategies and tactics through his own personal studies. When Greene attended a military parade and publicly endorsed war against Great Britain, he was expelled from his Quaker church. Greene made the courageous decision of putting his country and the ideals of the Revolution before everything, even his own church. Greene would remain a lifelong Quaker and constantly struggle to reconcile his personal beliefs with the beliefs of his pacifist church. When war began, Greene rushed south at the head of the Rhode Islander Kentish Guard, a militia group he helped to form. During the Siege of Boston, Nathaniel Greene and George Washington made acquaintances. Greene became a general and quickly became one of Washington's most trusted advisors. In the ensuing years, Nathaniel Greene served Washington loyally. At the Battle of Brandywine, Greene led a heroic rearguard action, and at Valley Forge, Greene served in the crucial role of Quartermaster General, securing supplies for the beleaguered Continental Army. However, it was in the southern theater of the war that Nathaniel Greene secured his legacy. In December 1780, Nathaniel Greene was sent south to take charge of the ragtag Southern Army. In Greene's own words, the army was wretched beyond description. In addition to having little food and supplies, the Southern Continental Army was also inferior to the British numerically. Against poor odds and in the face of a highly disciplined enemy force, Nathaniel Greene did the unthinkable. He divided his Southern Continental Army into two forces. One smaller detachment was sent under Daniel Morgan to counter Banastre Tarleton, infamous for taking no prisoners. The other was commanded by Greene himself, and he would counter Charles Cornwallis. The stage was set for decisive engagements in the South. In early 1781, General Morgan crushed Banastre Tarleton by effectively employing a double envelopment strategy. Meanwhile, Greene and Cornwallis did not come to direct blows for some time. Instead, Greene baited Cornwallis northward, only engaging in favorable skirmishes along the way. Finally, at Guilford Courthouse, Greene and Cornwallis fought a large-scale battle. Nathaniel Greene arranged his army into a three-line defense in depth. The first two lines were composed by militia. The final line was composed by Continental regulars. A formation reminiscent of Hannibal's at the Battle of Zama, the three-line defense in depth was designed to tire the redcoats through combat with the militia forces, so that when they reached the final line, they were depleted in the face of Greene's crack troops. Although the Continentals were ultimately defeated, it was a Pyrrhic victory for the British. Cornwallis lost nearly 25% of his southern British army, and Greene's maneuvers after the battle led Cornwallis ever northward into Virginia, where he, Cornwallis, made the fateful decision to hunker down in Yorktown. Soon thereafter, Cornwallis would surrender to a combined Franco-American land and sea force. Greene, however, did not revel in the American victory. While Washington, Rochambeau, and Lafayette dealt the final blow to the British at Yorktown, Nathaniel Greene was in South Carolina and Georgia, mopping up the remaining British forces. Thus, he solidified his legacy. In addition to being known as the Fighting Quaker, he also became known as the Savior of the South. Despite multiple memorializations, nicknames, and famed exploits, Nathaniel Greene is an oft-overlooked figure of the American Revolution. Despite his religious beliefs against bearing arms, Nathaniel Greene served a greater good. Today, we can follow Greene's example by putting our country first before the political and social conflicts that divide our country. Nathaniel Greene fought for a higher cause, and he ensured the freedoms that we take for granted today. Despite his lack of present-day popularity, Nathaniel Greene, his influence on history remains profound. Greene's persistent spirit, which should serve as an example for all Americans, is best exemplified by a quote from Greene himself: "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again."
The most famous bullet and the most famous blame game in American history is the first shot at the Battle of Lexington. As a child, I was fascinated that the Revolutionary War could somehow hinge on a single shot. That shot both marked the start of the American Revolution and inspired revolutions in France and Haiti. Yet strangely, no one knows which side, American or British, fired the famous bullet. In the language of our times, you might ask which side was to blame for starting the American Revolution. But let me answer my question with another question. Does it really matter who fired the first shot? The backstory of this famous moment might help us. In 1775, British General Thomas Gage decided to seize the weapons and ammunition being stored by the Americans in Concord, Massachusetts. Thankfully, American spies caught wind of the plan. During Paul Revere's famous midnight ride, patriots spread throughout the countryside and warned residents of the impending 800 British regulars dispatched to Concord. On April 19, 1775, more than 70 American Minutemen led by Captain John Parker faced off against the British regiment, who were then descending on the Lexington town green. One side fired the first shot, and British soldiers sent a volley of bullets, which killed 8 Minutemen. The British then continued on to Concord. When a fire got out of control, hundreds of Minutemen outside Concord thought the whole town was being torched. Some ran toward Concord's North Bridge, where the British fired first and fell back when colonists returned the volley. The British prepared to slowly return to Boston, but the overwhelming numbers of Minutemen forced a running retreat. The battles of Lexington and Concord demonstrated that the Americans would not be easily crushed, as General Gage had hoped. In today's society, which side fired the first shot at Lexington might materially affect our opinion of who was in the right or the wrong. Let's look at this battle in a vacuum and assume that the Americans fired the first shot. By antagonizing the British, one of the greatest military powers on earth, the Americans could be viewed as criminals. The poor British were forced to fight back. Contrarily, assume that the British fired the first shot. By attacking a much smaller force, the British were bloodthirsty tyrants, and the eventual American victory was an act of pure self-defense. But the first shot at Lexington wasn't fired in a vacuum. The British viewed the colonies as an entity whose ultimate purpose was to support the British Empire. The colonists viewed that role as unacceptable, and that view ultimately developed into their desire for American independence. The fundamentally opposed views of the British and Americans about America's place in the world could never peacefully coexist. Based upon the underlying pressures that existed on both sides of the conflict, had it not been the battles of Lexington and Concord, it would have been the battle of some other town. I understand the desire to play the blame game. When I was a child, I watched my mother get run over by a truck because she put herself in its path to protect me. I spent years pivoting between guilt and anger, blaming myself, the truck driver, the people who didn't yell in time. And one day, I couldn't live in that haze of blame anymore. I needed to release it. It didn't matter whose fault it was. It happened. Only by ending the constant blame game in my own mind was I able to move forward and focus on my mother's slow, unlikely recovery. Thus, at any basic level, it doesn't matter who fired the first shot. What matters is that it was fired. The blame game about who fired first is counterproductive to understanding the underlying views that are at the heart of the conflict. The US could no longer be a British colony. The people had decided upon independence, just like my ancestor, Caleb Abbott, who was in the company of Captain John Parker at the Battle of Lexington 247 years ago. As our country begins to recognize the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, we must remember that the underlying roots of a conflict are far more important than the minutiae of a particular moment in time. The Battle of Lexington teaches us that what truly matters is why and how a conflict developed. I'm not a young child anymore, and I no longer spend days wondering about who really shot first. It doesn't matter. When we look at conflicts today, from the invasion of Ukraine to Afghanistan, we cannot play the blame game. America cannot play the blame game. We need to focus on the larger picture instead of specific moments or people. On an individual level, we can all benefit from greater acceptance and less blame. Only then will we move forward. Thank you.
It was a crisp autumn day on October 19, 1781. The Continental Army was in the midst of an intense siege against the British in Yorktown, Virginia. After enduring weeks of bombardment, British General Lord Charles Cornwallis finally surrendered to General George Washington. This was the last major battle of the American Revolution. Although the British still had 30,000 troops along the eastern coast of North America, the defeat at Yorktown was demoralizing for Britain and signaled American victory. The Revolutionary War officially ended on September 3, 1783, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The Revolution began as a civil war between the American colonists and Great Britain. However, it was more than just a civil war. It was, in fact, a war of international importance. American colonists won only with the invaluable assistance of France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic. To fully understand the global dynamics of the Revolutionary War, we need to look at the events leading up to it. The 1754 to 1763 French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, involved Britain, France, and Spain. Now, at the time, Britain had the world's most powerful navy, so when the revolution started, France and Spain were looking to restrain this superpower. They provided assistance to American colonists to weaken the British Empire and secure trade relations with America. Thus, power and expanding trade were the main motivations for these countries' alliances with the American colonists. One of the most important of these alliances was between France and the Continental Army. The Battle of Yorktown could not have been won without French assistance. In fact, approximately 10% of battlefield deaths during the war were of French soldiers. France began providing military and financial assistance in 1776, well before openly declaring war in June of 1778. In September of the following year, Washington met with the French minister, who offered troops to aid the Continental Army. Initially, Washington hesitated to have ground soldiers from another country. However, after a series of losses in Newport and Savannah in 1778 and 1779, he accepted the offer of assistance. On July 11, 1780, French General Rochambeau arrived at Newport, Rhode Island. He soon met with Washington later that year to discuss strategy. During this time, the Continental Army was short on food, supplies, and clothes to fight against the British in New York and Savannah, and they were only able to adequately defend their positions in New Jersey and along the Hudson River. Washington and Rochambeau met again in May of 1781 to officially join the French and Continental troops together. Rochambeau had an army of less than 6,000, with Washington commenting that the French soldiers appeared in the grandest parade uniform. According to Rochambeau, the Continental soldiers, on the other hand, appeared quite differently. He said, "It was really painful to see these brave men almost naked with only some trousers and little linen jackets, most of them without stockings." Despite this, he went on to note that the Continental soldiers were cheerful, healthy, and persistent. Now with French aid, the siege of Yorktown started on August 18, 1781. These plans were kept secret to prevent the British from sending in reinforcements prior to battle. Rochambeau even ordered ovens to be built west of New York to divert attention and make the British believe that the French were setting up permanent camp elsewhere. All the while, the French used their navy to prevent the British from escaping Yorktown. They successfully surrounded and captured Cornwallis and his 9,000 British troops. After several weeks, victory and liberty were secured. As we look forward to celebrating the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, it is critical now, more than ever, that we use this time to reflect on the founding of our nation. We must focus our efforts on helping the public re-engage with and learn from the past. Even today, our democracy and economic success are greatly influenced by our relations with other countries. We need to understand our national history and realize that our future is not determined in isolation from other nations. Rather, we live in a global community where nations must work together to defend democracy and the free world. The ideals of the Constitution set out by our founding families are constantly being challenged. Defending democracy requires vigilance by the people and alliances between nations. This fight to defend our basic rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness began with the American Revolution and continues to this very day.
Since our country's roots, Americans have long maintained and upheld the belief that government is a social contract. That is, those in power exist solely to serve the will and best interest of the people. If they fail to do so, the people have the right and duty to overthrow them. However, history shows that rebellion demands bloodshed and tremendous sacrifice, so it is often seen as the last resort after numerous negotiation attempts have failed. This was precisely the situation that the colonists, your ancestors, found themselves in before the Revolutionary War began. Initially, they never intended to break away from Great Britain. In fact, many of the colonists proudly identified as British subjects and even remained loyal to King George throughout the Revolution. They enjoyed the security of the British military and the economic ties they had with them. And for years, King George allowed the colonies a certain level of freedom to operate and organize their societies as they pleased, as long as they, in turn, remained economically prosperous for England. All was well with this agreement, until King George decided to crack down on the colonies, taxing and exploiting them for funds when they had no say in the matter. And in true American fashion, once the colonists had had a taste of freedom, there was no going back. The colonists felt that their rights were being violated and they began to resist, engaging in rebellious acts, such as dumping tons of tea into the Boston Harbor to protest the Tea Act, or boycotting sugar and paper products to avoid the Stamp and Sugar Acts. King George knew of their opposition to his laws, but instead of granting their perfectly reasonable request for representation in Parliament, he responded with even more intrusive taxes and harsher punishments for disobeying them. Seeing that their voices were not being acknowledged or valued in any capacity, the Continental Congress wrote and sent a formal document called the Olive Branch Petition, essentially offering King George one final chance to compromise. John Dickinson, the primary writer of the document, clearly reiterated the fact that the colonists resented the idea of breaking away from their government, but they felt that they had no choice. He wrote that the forceful and unjust actions of the Crown, quote, have compelled us to arm in our own defense, and have engaged us in a controversy so peculiarly abhorrent to the affections of your still faithful colonists. However, King George essentially scoffed at the colonists' plea for peace, refusing to even read it. This was the last straw. The colonists had done all they could, but King George had refused to budge. The social contract had broken. It was now time for revolution. Your ancestors valued their rights and liberty so highly that they were willing to give up their identity and security as British subjects, take up arms, and fight for freedom against the most powerful military force on the planet. They had to try, because they felt, as Patrick Henry famously exclaimed, "Give me liberty or give me death." Even though the colonists had far less military resources and skill than the British, they were united under a common cause and strengthened by values that have remained fundamental to the American spirit: liberty, freedom, inalienable rights, and self-government. They took these principles with them after winning both the war and their independence from Great Britain, especially during the Constitutional Convention, where negotiation and compromise once again proved fundamental to the fate of the country. The task of creating our system of government was by no means easy, given that the 13 states were vastly different in almost every way. Moreover, what larger states such as Virginia envisioned for government was extremely different than what smaller states like New Jersey wanted. Stark Federalists such as Alexander Hamilton and James Madison pushed for a strong, efficient central government, whereas anti-federalists like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry thought, smaller is better. But unlike King George, the Founding Fathers knew the value of freely exchanging their thoughts and ideas and engaging in civil discourse. They were able to let go of their partisan mindsets and blend together elements of multiple ideologies to unite the states and find ways to accommodate all 13. After several months of negotiation, debate, and compromise, they finally finished drafting the United States Constitution and set the foundation of our great nation. Compromise between the people and government, as well as the people between themselves, is essential to who America is at its core. However, as we approach our 250th year anniversary, it is important to recognize that in today's society, many are forgetting our roots and losing their ability to compromise. Partisan divides are becoming more hostile, polarized, and violent than ever before, and in many cases, people of opposing viewpoints are unable to engage in civilized discourse or find any middle ground. The media, which should serve as a marketplace for ideas and a way to express one's views freely, has become dangerously one-sided, censoring messages and people that clash with its narrative. This cancel culture is a direct threat to the free speech and discourse that your ancestors cherished so deeply and embodied so beautifully. As a society, we need to fight against these divisions and be more receptive toward ideas that are different than our own, as long as they are consistent with America's core values established at the founding. We are a country made up of people of many different skill sets, lifestyles, and opinions, and just like for the colonists, in order to coexist, we must be able to find common ground.
Americans, bear in remembrance the horrid massacre when 5 of your fellow countrymen lay basely and most inhumanely murdered. These are the words that an American newspaper used to describe the events that took place March 5th, 1770, when an unruly crowd and uneasy British soldiers found themselves at odds outside of the King's Custom House. The Boston Massacre would result in 5 dead American colonists and 8 British soldiers in chains awaiting trial on murder charges. Newspapers were the only media of the 18th century, and they clearly indicated that the martyrs who had been struck down on that fateful night in King Street in Boston had been mercilessly murdered at the hands of British soldiers who had no regard for patriot lives. And though this portrayal was cried out as fact among the colonies, one staunch patriot and future founding father John Adams was more interested in truth and justice than bettering his public position by standing with those who were seeking revenge. And we are all better for it. But how did The citizens of the crown and its soldiers sent to restore order find themselves at a point of such violent animosity. It was a series of acts passed by a parliament across an ocean meant to enrich the mother country at the expense of the colonists. But keep in mind, these same colonist ancestors had demonstrated their unwillingness to wear chains of tyranny by crossing that very same ocean. While these unpopular attempts to generate revenue through taxation without representation started back with the Navigation Act of 1651, it was the Stamp Act of 1765 that is more often considered to be the tipping point that started the American Revolution. Many know that this act attempted to tax all paper printed for both commercial and legal use. But the most onerous aspect of this act was actually its suspension of the right to trial by jury. This had been a direct assault on the right to a fair trial, which had been the bedrock of any just society since the Magna Carta guaranteed the due process of law in 1215. John Adams understood that any perversion of this right would have invalidated any patriotic claim to a righteous cause. And so he took up the defense of British soldiers, even though it was at great risk to himself, for what he would later write was, quote, one of my most gallant, generous, manly, disinterested actions of my whole life, and one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country. John Adams was proven right in taking up the defense of these ruthless British soldiers when 6 were acquitted of all charges and only 2 were found guilty of manslaughter, with a sentence reduction to nothing more than a branding on their right thumb. While it may seem strange that I would choose to discuss John Adams' successful defense of 8 British soldiers who had indeed fired into a crowd of American colonists, I believe it demonstrates the leadership our nation held at its birth, that over the last 250 years we have lost in the leadership we now need more than ever in today's cancel culture that is nothing more than mob mentality. Too many of our leaders today are willing to go along with what is best for their poll numbers instead of what is best for their nation. If you know anything about the events of the War of Independence, then you know its results defy human reasoning. Only those wholly determined not to see it would deny the divine intervention that was clearly at work at the birth of our nation. A nation meant to be, as Ronald Reagan would say, quote, a shining city upon a hill, whose beacon light guides freedom-loving people everywhere. Had the leaders of our cause, like John Adams, catered to the popular narrative and allowed these British soldiers to fall prey to the hangman's noose, as the coming guillotine would in the soulless French rebellion without a fair trial, would our fledgling colonies have suffered a similar fate as they did? As we approach the 250th anniversary since the birth of our great nation, we are facing increasing pressures to conform to the narratives that characterize our media sources. The character of our nation is once again being tested. Who will stand up for what is right, even whenever it is unpopular? Who will be a voice against the heap of propaganda that characterizes our social media? I am confident that the divine providence will continue to raise up leaders who will think for themselves in light of what is best for their nation. As John Adams did when, at great risk to himself, he took up the defense of British soldiers against the judgment of death, as he would later write, would have been, quote, as foul a stain upon our nation as the execution of Quakers or witches anciently. Had our ancestors allowed these British soldiers to die with guilty written on their tombstone without ever being proven as such, our nation would have a foundation that is fractured and destined to break. But this is not how our nation began. Our nation was founded on the principle of doing what is right regardless of popular opinion or media bias. We must not allow ourselves to be silenced by the media and stand up for what we know is right. Who will be our modern day John Adams? If not us, then who?
Each year, thousands of passionate tourists visit the Old Stone House in Brooklyn. Why? because this farmhouse is where the American Revolutionary War almost ended moments after it began. If not for the courage and dedication of the 1st Maryland Regiment of 400 volunteer militiamen, we would not be standing here today as proud Americans. In the summer of 1776, the British, who wanted to crush the revolution immediately, sent hundreds of ships, one of the biggest armadas in history, to New York Harbor. Led by General William Howe, the British formulated a plan to attack General George Washington and his Continental Army in New York. On August 22nd, General Howe landed 15,000 troops on Long Island. And only 4 days later, the British began their assault on the Continental Army. The British split their troops and managed to flank the American forces by sending a force through the Jamaica Pass, which was lightly guarded. This flanking maneuver trapped the Continental Army in Brooklyn. On August 27th, 2,000 British troops occupied and surrounded the Old Stone House. Trapped by the British, General William Alexander, self-proclaimed Lord Stirling, was determined to engage the British at the Old Stone House and cut through the enemy forces. In an act of courage and patriotism, the remainder of the regiment under his command, now commonly known as the Maryland 400, attacked the British to allow the remainder of the American forces to retreat across the Gowanus Creek to the safety of the Brooklyn Heights. Although they were outnumbered 5-1, it did not matter. Each individual soldier understood that what they were fighting for was bigger than themselves. The freedom of their children, their wives, and the future generations of Americans was at stake. When the fighting at the Old Stone House ceased, 256 Marylanders lay lifeless on the ground. 100 more men were wounded and only 9 made it back to the American front lines. Roughly 65% of the attacking force perished in one of the largest fatality rates of any battle in American history. As Washington gazed upon this horrific scene from a nearby hill, he could only comment, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." But the death of these valiant soldiers did not go in vain. The extra time they had bought with their lives ended the battle for the day. While the American forces remained camped in their fortification on the Brooklyn Heights, the British made plans for a siege of the American position. To confront this critical situation, Washington gathered his commanders to discuss possible initiatives. They proposed 2 plans. Plan number 1 was to fight to the end, to unite the entire Continental Army in a fateful attempt to ensure that the British would not invade further into their homes. However, even then, they would still be significantly outnumbered, and the cost of failure was simply too high. Plan number 2 was to evacuate the Continental Army to Manhattan by crossing the East River. But this recourse required time, and time was luxury that Washington and his comrades did not have. A nor'easter and unfavorable winds prevented British reinforcements from sailing up the East River and trapping the American forces on the Brooklyn Heights. 2 days of rain helped delay the inevitable British assault. On the night of August 29th and into the early morning hours during a heavy fog, the entire Continental Army was evacuated to Manhattan without the loss of a single life. The Maryland 400 had done their job. Their sacrifice had saved the revolution. Today, as our nation approaches its 250th anniversary, American soldiers continue to risk their lives to uphold certain unalienable rights endowed upon us by our Creator: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These brave men and women are willing to sacrifice anything to defend the core values of our nation: freedom, justice, equality. But they cannot do it alone. As citizens of this great nation, we must, like our soldiers, face each issue with relentless courage and conviction. We must work with our friends, our families, our neighbors to defend democratic values from tyrannical practices. Together, we must continue the legacy that the Maryland 400 left behind. We must ensure that the next 250 years will be as venerable as the last. May God bless America. Thank you.